Shabbat Shalom. So if I were to ask you the opposite of pessimism, you would say?
Optimism.
Wrong. So, yes, it is an antonym. That would be what the thesaurus would say. You're all fine. I just said that for shock value. It's okay, it's okay, it's okay. Yes, generally speaking, we think of pessimism and optimism as being antonyms, as being the opposite of one another. But when we look at the underlying emotions and process that leads one to be an optimist or to be a pessimist, we find they are actually beginning from a similar, if you'll pardon me, flaw. That is to say, a pessimist is someone who believes that despite all evidence to the contrary, things are going to get worse. An optimist, on the other hand, believes that despite all evidence to the contrary, things are going to get better. Do we see the commonality? What is the commonality, Bernie?
Well, things are only changing.
But what is the commonality between pessimism and optimism in that definition?
Well, they're opposites that attract.
They're opposites that attract, yes, absolutely. But fundamentally, both of them are impervious to evidence. Neither an optimist nor a pessimist is open to any additional information that could possibly sway them from their current opinion of what's going to happen next. If somebody who is a pessimist wins the lottery, they are immediately going to imagine all the horrible things that are going to take place now that they have won. And somebody who is an optimist that is hit by a bus is going to, while they are lying on the ground, immediately be imagining all the amazing things that are yet to happen because of this event. Neither is willing to admit that winning the lottery is a pretty good thing and being hit by a bus is a pretty lousy thing, and that it, all things being equal, would be better to win the lottery than to be hit by a bus. That imperviousness to evidence, to change our opinion, is why those who hold to either pessimism or optimism are actually kindred spirits. They are people who have decided from the beginning what they wish or what they imagine will happen next, and they are unwilling to let go of it at all costs. Which is why, classically, Judaism is neither a pessimistic nor an optimistic religion. We are, in fact, a hopeful religion. Now, hope does have a more natural antonym, a more natural opponent. That is to say, an actual proper opposite. The opposite of hope, if I were to ask you, would be, don't worry, I'm not going to get wrong, I'm not going to buzz you out if you make it wrong. Despair, right? Hope versus despair, right? So what is the definition of despair? Despair is things can never change for the better, as opposed to hope, where things can change for the better. Both agree that change could potentially be possible, but one holds out that change in a positive way, hope is the possibility, and the other holds out that change in the negative way, or not in the positive way, is a possibility, but both hold that there are possibilities, that change can occur. Merely one of them is ruling out a type of change rather than the other. Now, you may be saying, okay, well then we can have a choice. I can choose to despair, I can choose to hope. No. Now you're back into pessimism and optimism land. Now you are making your decision without any information, without any attempt to find evidence that should lead you to either hope or despair. And that is not hope and despair, that is optimism, pessimism, and as we've already said, those are not, in general, healthy attitudes. So why might hope be the more logical, the more rational, the more grounded opinion to have rather than despair? Well, for a number of reasons. First of all, history has told us that things can change for the better. Say what you will about the problems that the world has faced over the last 10,000 years of history that we have some grasp of. By and large, things have, from time to time, gotten better than they were before. To believe only in despair, to think that despair is the natural mentality for the world, is to ignore the history of 10,000 years, where on a Monday you could be sick, and on a Tuesday you could be feeling better. On one year your crops could fail, and the next year your crops could be good. This is not to deny the fact that some years your crops are good and the next year the crops fail, but For hope to exist, we don't need to establish that it will always get better. For hope to exist, we only establish it can get better. To believe that it will always get better no matter what is back into optimism land, and we've ruled that out. To believe that it can get better is well-founded based upon historical precedent. We have, even as Jews, and even with our rough history, as we sit here in the air-conditioned comfort of Florida and bask within each other's company in a free and an open society, allowed to proud proclaim our Judaism and embrace our culture and tradition as we see fit, we would be fairly pig-headed to say that things have never gotten better, because we know that this is a privileged place throughout our people's history. But it's not only history that allows us to imagine that things can get better. It's also science. Yes, there is scientific grounds for believing in hope, for having hope. Very much, if we look at the world around us, if we follow the basic laws of science, the laws of physics, thermodynamics, chemical, all of that good stuff, one of the fundamental principles is entropy. Things break down. Things return to chaos. And yet, when we look around, things are a little chaotic, but they are not chaotic in the scientific definition of that word. We have not scattered our atoms to the four corners of the universe to such that there cannot be even primary elements. We are collected, maybe not always calm, but we are cohesive, and we are able to, as we've seen through scientific research and engineering and skills of technical feat, we are able to create enduring forms of order. We are able to overcome that tendency for things to break and either make them endure or repair them if they do tend to break. Science tells us that things can change for the better, the definition of hope. But of course, we are sitting here in a sanctuary, which means I also have to mention the biggie. That is to say, the theological grounds for hope. Now, on the surface, it's very plain. We read through the 7 weeks from Tisha B'Av all the way up till Rosh Hashanah, Haftarot that are specifically designed to remind us to have hope, that God has not turned his back on us, that God still wishes the world to be perfected, God is still helping us to have the strength to move on and improve. Hope is the theme for almost 2 months straight throughout this time of year. And it's that hope that inspires us to enter the gates of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, the Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, with some level of, well, hope that we will be able to also change for the better or change our community for better as well. But perhaps the words of Revelation are not quite sufficient to convince you that God has hope in mind as our natural state. And so I'll leave you with the more primary, but also the more obvious example. Hope is the natural state. The idea that things can change for the better is the natural state, because that was the reason for creation in the first place. We go all the way back to Bereshit, as I point to our ark doors where the words are written from the beginning of Torah. And when we remember that God is echad, God is one, meaning that God is existent in God's unique way, both before time began, before creation began, and is existent simultaneously and unchangingly at the end of all time, when this physical world does eventually disappear, then we recognize that God saw the entire pattern of reality before God made reality. It would be a pretty sad thing for God to have seen the entire unfolding of all of creation and see it crumble into despair and terror and pain as an uninterrupted march towards darkness and suffering, and go ahead and still make it. Why would God create a world where suffering was the inevitable conclusion to all life? No. God looked at the tapestry of where we would go through our free choice and will, at what we would guide the world to become, and said, you know what? It's going to work out. Eventually, yes, with a lot of twists and turns and many, many chapters in the book, eventually by the time this reaches its conclusion, when creation is done, it will indeed be better than it was at the start. Indeed, humanity will make it. And thus, it is worthwhile to bring creation into existence. Thus, Bereshit bara Elohim God began to create. God only created knowing the end, and that the end would be better than the beginning. So does that mean then that we are meant to be optimistic? Well, remember, optimism is not the word du jour, hope is. And one of the fundamental differences between the benighted belief in optimism that things will always get better and the belief in hope that things can get better is that hope requires us to take our portion of responsibility. Optimism relieves us of any duty to act, because after all, things will get better no matter what. Why should I bother lifting a finger to make that happen? But if I have hope, well, hope merely tells me that there is potential, that there is an opportunity, that there is an opening, there is a chance to make things better, and that it is up to me to move the needle. It is up to me to push along that direction in order that things will be better, not merely in potential, but in actuality. So hope is much more tiring than optimism. Optimism asks very little, just as pessimism asks for very little. Hope says, yes, believe that the world can be a better place, and then get to work. Shabbat Shalom.